Welcome to part 2 of Disabilities, Diversity, and Inclusion, the Impacts of Ableism. This is the second part of a 4-part program designed to introduce parents, caregivers, providers, and people with disabilities to the concept of ableism. After completing the program, you'll not only be able to recognize ableism, you'll also be able to apply what you have learned to dismantle it. Before we begin, I'd like to review these 2 content notes. First, this program contains references to ableism and some offensive language. This information is included for the purposes of educating others on the harm caused by ableism. Second, this presentation uses both person-first and identity-first language interchangeably, since either may be used depending on individual preference. When interacting with people with disabilities, it's important to consider individual preferences first. As you may recall from part 1, we'll use 4 questions to guide us on our study of ableism, including: what is ableism? Why does it matter? What does ableism look like? What can we do about it? Part 1 looked at the question, what is ableism, by offering you some definitions, a framework for how ableism appears in our thoughts and our actions, and some history and models that are commonly used to explain ableist behavior. In part 2, we'll explore the different groups impacted by ableism and illustrate how ableism impacts not only people with disabilities, but also our communities at large. Let's get started. I'd like to start by sharing a quote from Lila Watson, a Murray visual artist, activist, and academic working in the field of women's issues and Aboriginal epistemology. She said, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Because your liberation is bound up with mine. Let's unpack that here and see what it means. Watson is speaking from her intersectional position as both an Indigenous person and as a woman. When she suggests that your liberation is bound up with hers, she's inviting you to acknowledge, even from positions of relative privilege and power, that we are all impacted by oppression. The systems approach is commonly used in social work to understand how experiences of an individual are interconnected with others, with society, and with the environment. If we look at the disabled person as the center of the system, we can imagine the impacts of ableism rippling outward through social systems of family, friends, employer, church or temple, community, and beyond. A lot like when you toss a rock into a still pond. The person with a disability may be the target of prejudice or oppression, but the impact of the attitude or action is much broader. We'll begin with people with disabilities because this group is essentially ground zero for ableism. When we look at ableism, it impacts people with disabilities in 2 ways. Overt ableism tends to be intentional and easily recognized. Examples include exclusion, using disability as a punchline, and violence. In most cases of overt ableism, there's an awareness that the act is hurtful. Yet, as we learned in part 1, the act is seen as justified by the perpetrator because it helps that person or group maintain power and privilege. Covert ableism is much more subtle and may not even be recognized as such by the person engaging in it. Covert ableism can show up in our language, for example, referring to something you don't like as lame. It can also show up as failing to think about access. For example, choosing a movie for your friend's movie night that doesn't offer closed captioning. Acts of covert ableism are often called microaggressions because when you experience just one of them, it can feel more like an annoyance. Over time and with repeated exposure, a person who experiences microaggressions can internalize them, resulting in a state of what is called internalized ableism. A person with a disability who begins to experience internalized ableism may project negative feelings onto themselves. Let's consider a fictional case example. An adult wheelchair user named Ben has exceptional knowledge about nature and local environment. A staff position is available at a nearby nature center, but Ben accepts the job welcoming guests at a big box store without even investigating the nature center job. When asked why he didn't follow his dream of working at the nature center, Ben explains that he always has trouble navigating the pathways with his wheelchair, and he was worried that he would be a burden on the Nature Center staff. In this case, Ben has internalized the lack of access he experienced with the Nature Center trails to mean that his potential contributions are worth less to the Nature Center than a non disabled person. Here's another example. Linda was diagnosed with postural tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, which is a condition where abnormal heart rate can cause dizziness and fainting. After a fainting experience in the grocery store parking lot, Linda's doctor recommended an accessible parking placard for her car. A week later, Linda returns to the grocery store. She parks in the reserved accessible parking spot. As she gets out of her car, a woman yells that she looks just fine and that she should be ashamed for being too lazy to walk into the store. Linda's so horrified by the incident, she gets back in the car and leaves without doing her shopping. From then on, she refuses to use the placard, even though some days the act of walking into the store from the parking lot exhausts her for the rest of the day. Linda's experience with internalized ableism has left her to believe that she doesn't deserve accommodations that would give her the capability to do more with what she has. In their study of responses to ableism, Neely Barnes et al. Identified 4 response types commonly used by families. Empowering response types, which included educating and informing, help families advocate for social change. According to the researchers, families who chose to educate others on their child's disability or who were willing to inform others about their child's needs experienced higher levels of empowerment. These families also acted in ways that ended up creating more inclusive environments for their children. Neely Barnes et al. Also found that families would sometimes choose to ignore ableism or hide their child's diagnosis from others. These actions were often used when the family decided that it would be ineffective to advocate for change. For example, one of the focus groups interviewed, parents of children who had sickle cell disease, showed that they sometimes chose to hide their child's diagnosis during job interviews. Their rationale was that they would not be hired if their employers knew about the diagnosis because it often requires them to miss work while caring for their child. Neely Barnes et al. Suggests that hiding a diagnosis or ignoring someone who has committed an ableist act is an example of internalized ableism. In other words, the parents in the study were keeping manifestations of their child's disability hidden as much as possible to keep other people in the community happy. Let's look at another example that happens with families. LaShawn and her 7-year-old son Jason are at the store. As LaShawn places her items on the belt at the checkout, Jason spies his favorite fruit snacks in the cart of the shopper behind them. He instantly grabs the fruit snacks from the other shopper's cart and pushes the box into his mother's arm, upending a gallon of milk she was putting on the belt. There's a huge mess, and the clerk sighs loudly while alerting maintenance. As they wait for someone to bring a mop, the shopper behind them scolds LaShawn for being a bad parent. LaShawn is embarrassed, but doesn't tell the clerk or the other shopper that Jason is autistic. LaShawn has experienced covert ableism as part of a family unit that includes her disabled son, because the clerk and the shopper assumed that Jason was a typical child with poor behavior. The fact that LaShawn chose to hide Jason's diagnosis would indicate that she did not feel empowered to do anything to help at that moment. What's even more challenging in this case example is LaShawn and Jason's intersectionality with race. At age 7, Jason may be perceived as an unruly child, but as he becomes an adult, outsiders are statistically more likely to jump to conclusions about his behavior. According to a white paper produced by the Rudderman Family Foundation, 1/3 to 1/2 of all use of force incidents involving police involve disabled civilian. The white paper also elaborates that disability intersects with other factors such as race, class, gender, sexuality to magnify degrees of marginalization and increase risk of violence. In effect, Jason and his family must find ways to cope with a double dose of marginalization that comes from both Jason's disability and their family's identity as a racial minority. In the previous 2 examples, we looked at ableism from the perspective of people who either directly or indirectly experience prejudice. However, ableism frequently impacts the community at large in indirect ways. In the first example, a knowledgeable candidate never even considered a job where he may have been a great asset due to ableism. In the second example, a mother felt disempowered to make a more inclusive environment for her child. We see similar experiences in schools, churches, and other community organizations as demonstrated by this now viral photo, tweeted by Sarah Marie De Silva, a zoology student at the University of Hull in the United Kingdom. Students in this lecture may have been able to benefit from dialogue with De Silva, but her position in the classroom makes that sort of engagement difficult, if not completely impossible. When people with disabilities and their families experience ableism, the entire community loses. Ben may have been the best employee the Nature Center ever had. LaShawn and her son could have been part of a neighborhood that benefits from all kinds of diversity. Sarah Marie De Silva could have contributed to the shared learning in her zoology class. These are things we'll never know because of the way ableism impacts us. I'd like to close this part of the program with a quote from Henry Ford. Ford was no saint, but he saw the value of employing people with disabilities. According to an article by Alan Rucker, Ford employed almost 10,000 people with disabilities in different jobs throughout the manufacturing process. The quote reads, "Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success." Ableism prevents us from coming together. As long as ableism exists, we will never make it to success. Thank you for joining me. This concludes part 2 of this program. In part 3, we'll look at examples of ableism. We'll then move on to part 4 and share some different tools to help you dismantle ableism. Before we go, I'd once again like to thank some of the talented individuals who have helped make this program a reality. Thank you to Charisse Montgomery for your valuable insights into the experiences of Black Americans with disabilities. Sarah Rintamaki has helped support this program from the beginning with overwhelming encouragement and her insights into the experiences of families with disabled minor children. Finally, Lisa Ruman contributed to this project through an extension of her supervision work and by helping me to include systems and empowerment approaches consistent with social work values. I'm deeply grateful to each of you for your support.